You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding, combating stigma since 2021. I wanted there to be a podcast about hoarding disorder from somebody who hoarded rather than a professional. That didn't exist, so I created it. And that's this podcast that you're listening to now. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Dr Jan Eppingstall, a counsellor in Melbourne, Australia, who specialises in working with people who hoard. Jan, how are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you very much for asking. I'm very happy to be here once again.
So we are going to start again with a new occasional feature that we started in Jan's last episode. It is called Permission Slip.
Do you need a permission slip?
And in this little segment, normally me, but sometimes Jan brings something and asks for permission to get rid of it. And it's the kind of thing that we maybe don't understand why we've held on to, but we have, and for some reason it's sticking. So Jan, you have brought an item today. What's your item?
I have, and I'm not quite sure how to describe it, and particularly without laughing very hard. So many years ago, I must have at some point wanted to do the beehive look. So my mother was a saleswoman for Avon at the time. That may give some indication of when it was, because I think they've been out of business for
Yeah. You don't hear about Avon these days, do you?
No. So it's like a little plastic
hairband, but
thing, hairband thing. And so what you're supposed to do is put it on the top of your head, underneath a layer of hair, and then you're supposed to backcomb that hair and then brush it back, and it should give you a nice beehive shape. I've never used them. There's 3 different sizes plus 2 ponytail ones. They're in a special little box with a very useless instruction manual. And I have kept these, I swear it could easily be 20 years.
Okay, so I have some questions for you.
Great.
How often, on average, do you wake up in the morning and think, I'm gonna do a beehive today?
Never. And the fact that it's like got these little spikes on it, even if I did, I think I wouldn't be able to last all day because it would be so painful. But,
they look tight as well. They don't look like a good fit.
They're supposed to sort of sit on the head, and I don't know how. And then you comb it back and it's supposed to stay there like that. But it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But I kept it.
If you got rid of them, how many times do you think you would think, oh, I wish I'd kept those beehive clips?
Exactly 0. Exactly 0 times.
Do they have any nostalgic feelings for you?
Yes. I can actually honestly say yes. There is some nostalgia involved. There is some sentiment there around, a time when I thought that I could be bothered spending that much time in front of the mirror backcombing my hair. And also the fact that like technology's moved on as well, which is, this is kind of your belt and braces sort of. So it feels a little bit kind of novel in a way. So I think there is some nostalgia around it.
And is that nostalgia strong enough for it to deserve a space in your home?
No, sadly it's not.
Jan, I give you permission to get rid of the beehive hair clips.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'm going to, I don't know if you can hear me, Throw it
In the bin.
in the bin.
Well done.
Oh,
I feel like you will not be sad about this.
no. But it does, like just talking about it does, bring back some horrid memories of me thinking that was something that I would want to do at some point. I think it was when we had we were doing a lot of in the 90s, we were doing a lot of the velvet ribbon kind of headband look. I haven't got the velvet headbands anymore, but I do have some tortoiseshell ones that I have refused to let go of because I do use those occasionally.
One thing at a time. Well done. And Jan, if somebody is listening and has an item that they feel weirdly attached to and are having trouble to get rid of, do you give them permission to get rid of it?
I do. I give them a permission slip to get rid of it.
I do too. Can go. These days you hear a lot about things being trauma-informed, whether it's trauma-informed therapy or yoga or anything. And so today, Jan and I are talking about that. So first of all, what trauma-informed even means, but also we're going to look at trauma-informed ways to understand hoarding and trauma-informed approaches to treating hoarding, but also dealing with people who hoard, even if you're not providing treatment as such. So I know Jan and I have talked at length on and off the podcast about how this is a term that is often overused and that it can be a bit of a buzzword that can feel meaningless at times when it shouldn't be because it's a really important principle. But I think we need to start by looking at trauma, what trauma even is and how it relates to hoarding, first of all. So when we first talked about trauma on this podcast, on your first interview on the podcast, you defined trauma in a way that I found really powerful because it helped me to understand some of how we can have disproportionately high reactions to some things that don't seem all that traumatic, but then have disproportionately fine reactions to things that seem objectively terrible. So that seems like a good place to start. How do you define trauma?
I think I remember saying that trauma is something we experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope.
Yeah.
I think that was the way, and it is an excellent place to start because it kind of sets the tone for all that comes after it. It's focusing in on that. It's something that we've experienced and we can't cope with it. Our capacity to cope, is not there. So Peter Levine, who wrote the book Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, suggests that we experience trauma when our ability to respond to a perceived threat is in some way overwhelmed, which is the same thing reworded, but it just...
It adds a sense of powerlessness to it as well, doesn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. And it's our perception that impacts whether we experience something as life-threatening. So that's influenced by things like genetics. So there's that, intergenerational epigenetic responses. The history of previous trauma, depending on when it happens to us and whether there's been other things that have occurred in the past. Family dynamics, including caregiver attachment, which is a really big one, and an individual's temperament. So all of those things influence our perceptions, and that's why one person might just go, and someone else says that it's, the worst thing that's happened, it's catastrophic. And also why sometimes we feel like it's no big deal, or it's, again, the worst trauma we've ever experienced.
And also why I know I can look back at my life and say, why do I find that so difficult when worse things have happened to me?
Mm-hmm.
It's all of that, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And we can also be impacted by the way that the traumatic experience is approached by the people around us. And I guess that's exactly kind of what we're going to deep dive, into today. I read this definition by Alyssa Barbash, who says that trauma is a deeply disturbing event that infringes upon an individual's sense of control and may reduce their capacity to integrate the situation or circumstances into their current reality. And that kind of opens that up as well, what you were talking about before around, did you have any sense of control when that happened, or none at all? And how were you able to integrate it into your current reality? I think that's kind of important to mention as well.
And the prevalence of trauma in the life histories of people who hoard is really significant, right? It's not a rare thing to have a history of trauma.
No. We did talk quite a bit about that in episode, I think it was 25. But again, we just need to keep in mind that trauma is something we experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope, something we can't escape or fight, and we feel helpless and hopeless, which is something we've just mentioned as well. Over the years, I have not found anyone who has not had an experience of trauma in their history, and it's usually interpersonal trauma. So that means person-to-person or system-to-person abuse or neglect of all types. But what I think has solidified in my mind since we did our first podcast episode together is that all the people I have encountered with significant hoarding behaviours are attempting to control and cope with whatever life throws at them by surrounding themselves with objects that make them feel comfortable and safe. So like everything that's a trauma response, saving and acquiring was an adaptive method to increase a person's sense of safety at some time in the person's life. We do what works. This is something we talked about before as well. We can do something once and feel kind of a sense of euphoria or an easing of severe stress, a sense of relief, and then it sticks. It becomes a habit. So basically it worked right up until it didn't.
Yeah. Same as any kind of addiction or eating disorder or self-harm or so many of those things, they only stick because they work. It's maladaptive, it's problematic, all of that, but it wouldn't stick if it didn't do something in the first place. Exactly.
So I think that's kind of important for people to understand, that it's not a failing. It's not it was a way to engage with the world that allowed you to feel safe. And that's how we adapt to our environment as animals, basically. So it's not a failing. It was a clever thing to do at the time. It's not working now. So there's a need to replace that with something that is adaptive, that can allow you to engage with the world again.
And as Jan said, episode 25 is where we did a really deep dive into how trauma and hoarding are linked, and it's well worth a listen. So in terms of trauma-informed care, there is a lot written about this, and I read most of it.
Good luck to you.
And so a paper by Dr. Hayley Medlin and colleagues, and as ever, I will list all the papers in the show notes. Dr. Hayley Medlin described what trauma-informed care is, and it seems like a decent place to start. So it's a treatment approach that recognises the harmful consequences of trauma on the health and well-being of individuals. And she goes on to say it's not a treatment model, it's a supportive framework to help patients access and obtain greater benefit from their treatment. And she describes the core components of the framework as an emphasis on empowering patients, fostering patient-clinician collaboration, and minimising practices that might re-traumatise patients, including coercive approaches to care. That was talked about in the context of inpatient psychiatric patients, which is why she's talking patients rather than clients. But then I read a dissertation by Marcy Dupuis, who listed the 5 pillars of trauma-informed care. Basically, they're values that have been often eroded in the lives of people who've been traumatised. So these 5 pillars are safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment, which seem to back up the meddling approach broadly. I also found the 3 pillars, the 6 pillars, the 10 pillars, but the principles are roughly covered in that 5. So to start, would you say that summarises the generally understood meaning of trauma-informed?
Yes, it does cover it. It definitely covers it, whether it be the 3, 6, 9, 20, whatever. But I'd also kind of like to remind people that the number one rule when you're working with within this space is that we need to assume that every client that we face has a trauma background, particularly with hoarding. We know that the evidence is not fully there yet, but from anecdotal evidence, we know that is the case. So safety, trustworthiness and transparency, but also reliability, I think is really important to mention here. And this relates to hoarding in that I find many clients need, in order to feel safe, they need to be able to rely on you to be there at the right time, regularly, and engage with them on that basis. Reliability can seem like it doesn't really matter, but it does make a big difference to someone if you're showing up all the time to see them and they feel that sense of trust and safety. Collaboration and mutuality, we've got all these buzzwords here, haven't we? Empowerment, voice and choice. Again, these are all, ways that we should engage. But the other thing is cultural, historical and gender issues as well need to be encompassed, which wasn't included in some of those. And I think that's quite important to mention because those need to be included in order to really be empathetic and work with the person within their own space.
So trauma often always involves some degree of loss of control, which we touched on earlier. And I can see how all the pillars could immediately help with that aspect of things. So how does that look in practice when working with people who hoard in particular?
I think safety is central to all of this. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps the Score, makes it quite clear that visiting the past in therapy should be done while people are biologically speaking firmly rooted in the present and are feeling as calm and safe and grounded as possible. So if we embrace the essence of hoarding and the deeply rooted need for the stuff as a method of managing our emotions, we can see that pulling up our sleeves and getting stuck into the job of tidying up, in inverted commas, is harmful, right? The stuff is the physical manifestation of a person's feelings, a person's life history, a person's comfort. So this is why it's important for someone with clinically significant hoarding behaviours to have a mental health professional engaged in their journey, someone who can teach them ways to bring themselves back to the present and feel safe. That way, when they're engaged in any activity, they can and have some control over calming their nervous system themselves. Because feeling out of control, feeling like you are either hyper aroused where you fight, flight, freaking out, or whether you're hypo aroused, down in tortoise mode where you just can't get out of bed. It's important for that level of control to teach people and understand that so that they can move through the process with a sense of safety. That's kind of like core.
And that kind of, trying to work out how to word this because it sounds paradoxical, but as somebody who's been a client of therapists, of different therapists, one of the things that helps me to feel safe, this is the bit that sounds paradoxical, is the therapist having clear boundaries. Because if I feel like they haven't put some kind of structure, I don't know where the lines are for, the rest of it. And that makes me feel unsettled. Whereas if I feel like they are very boundaried, whether that's about time, whether that's about, some therapists hug, some don't, that kind of thing. I feel like it helps me to feel safe if it's clear what their boundaries are.
And what to expect, right?
What to expect. I think that's a big bit of
I think
it.
that's a big, exactly.
It's not like hugs are bad or hugs are good. It's knowing whether hugs are bad or good in that context.
Yeah, exactly.
So does the type of trauma a person has experienced affect the way that trauma-informed approaches work? Or is it more of an umbrella approach that's applied regardless of what the specific trauma of a person might look like? For instance, one big trauma versus ongoing low-level trauma versus multiple big traumas.
I think this is a really good question because not enough people understand the countless ways that ongoing interpersonal trauma in a person's history can show up as trauma triggers. Like if someone was in a devastating earthquake, people shouting and running in a building is likely to set off their safety response, right? Ducking under the table or reaching to protect a loved one, which I've seen in Japan, actually, when we lived there after the Hanshin earthquake. Or the classic of the returned soldier who disassociates when they hear a loud noise or a helicopter overhead. These are rare events, right? So they're not happening often for the person to be triggered necessarily. I think what is not understood or appreciated is how the tiniest thing could trigger someone's complex trauma response. A flash of disgust or pity on a support person's face. Opening a laptop in front of someone who has been emotionally abused by a family member who controlled their finances using technology as a weapon. Finding an object belonging to a loved one who's passed and being unable to save it. Even being triggered by seeing an object in the favourite colour of a loved one and wanting to save it. This means that there is a way of approaching everyone that allows them to feel safe, to trust their supports, make their own choices, collaborate and feel empowered in a way that aligns with their culture, generation and gender.
You know what makes this podcast work? It's you, the listeners. The show thrives due to your amazing support. I work hard on it, and all the time and money I invest is worth it because I know that it helps you as well as me. If you want to lend a hand, there are several options that can really, really help. You can make a one-off or recurring donation. You can head to your podcast app and leave a glowing review. Or you can do your bit to spread the word. If you know someone who hoards, or if you want your friends and family to understand your hoarding better, send them the link or share the episodes on social media. No matter which you do, you're helping keep that Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast on the air. Find out how to offer support at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. And it feels important to say, as a person with some serious chunks of trauma in her life, that you would hope that avoiding re-traumatizing people, having a collaborative approach to care and so on would go without saying. But that's not necessarily the case, especially in the history of psychiatry. So unfortunately, while it should go without saying, none of this goes without saying, does it?
No, I mean, you're right. Some horrific avoidable re-traumatizations occur in the therapist's office. And I think overconfident, dare I say, old school kind of practitioners who are oblivious to the impact they have on clients never, ever ceases to amaze me. Some of the stories I'm told, I'm just aghast. But I think we need to really be clear about what re-traumatization is. Simply put, it's when a person's then becomes now. So they're transported back to the time of the trauma and may have flashbacks or nightmares. Often they'll have intrusive thoughts, suicidal ideation or attempts. Hypervigilance is a big one. Many of my clients have, and panic attacks, wishing to isolate themselves, which is very much what occurs in hoarding. And they can be triggered by a person or a place or a sight, smell, sound, taste, touch. Particular phrases or songs can trigger a trip to the past traumatic event. For example, recently a client explained re-traumatization that occurred for them when they were watching a TV show. And what seemed to her was like an exact replica of her childhood trauma unfolded on the screen. Even if it wasn't exact, it felt to her like she was there.
Yeah.
And she couldn't sleep for days. And she's just having these repeated flashbacks to that one traumatic incident.
And I find that if I know something's coming that is a very similar thing to me, then I'm all right because I brace myself. It's the insidious bits that you're not expecting, because it's not like a dramatic reconstruction of what happened to you. It's someone saying a particular phrase in a particular way that you can't be warned about in advance. I appreciate warnings in advance about the obvious stuff, but it's often not the big, glaring, obvious stuff, is it?
No. And one thing we have to stress is that there is no guarantee that a person won't be re-traumatized. No. It's important because even the most highly trained therapists can trigger re-traumatization if the client hasn't experienced this context before, if something's just come out of the blue that they didn't realize was a trigger. Which means clinicians or anyone working with a trauma survivor must be able to prepare clients and assist them to come back to stabilization in the present. We can avoid re-traumatization by creating a container in the treatment process, which is what you were talking about before, where the clinician feels a sense of confidence and calmness, and the client feels safe in that healing relationship, knowing boundaries, being, safe within the confines of that relationship. Pacing is also incredibly important. Moving slower is a faster road, like the tortoise and the hare when treating trauma. That's really key. Another way is to track the client's nervous system responses. So this takes experience and knowledge to know what to look for, and also knowledge of the individual and experience with the individual too. It's not just general knowledge, it's about that person. Establishing at the beginning of the relationship, a method of quietly interrupting to bring a client's attention to what you see is happening in the moment can then kind of lead to moments of psychoeducation that can be delivered in real time, which makes them more effective. Working with the client to return to their window of tolerance multiple times during a session can help. So gives them the opportunity to feel the shift in safety and kind of be able to practice it on their own if something were to come up. So those sorts of things are things that therapists can do. None of this is easy.
No, and like you say, it's a kind of general approach that needs to be personalised, because when somebody knows me well enough, they'll know that if I start looking like I'm zoning out a bit, that's not okay. It might look very minor to somebody who doesn't know me, but bad things are happening.
Yeah.
And also, there can just be, like, the techniques and stuff you were talking about are all so useful, but also I've had many a therapy, like, those really hard-going therapy sessions where I've just been like, can we spend the last 5 minutes talking about the latest outrage on Married at First Sight, please? Because that's how I need to get back into the normal world.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's that rather than, or in addition to, not rather than.
Yeah, in addition to.
It's a holistic thing. Whereas other people would be like, I don't want to waste 5 minutes of my valuable therapy time talking about the barber from hell. People watching the current UK series will know who I'm talking about.
I'm intrigued now.
Oh, it's awful.
But that's right. Like, it might be something, for some people, I work with, it really is just sitting down and talking about, how the pets are going, or, having some sort of a very inconsequential conversation just to finally leave on a positive, I think it depends on the person.
Very much. So how I feel like I'm kind of lighting the blue touch paper here. So how can the term trauma-informed be misused, and what harm can that do?
Trauma-informed can be used by anyone who's done a 1 hour webinar or seminar or something, right? And this is something I've been grappling with recently because I've been seeing the negative results of some practitioners who are not kind of understanding the philosophy. They've done a course, they've understood it, but they're not really able to kind of embody it. As they said in the castle, it's a vibe, you know, it's similar to do no harm.
Yes.
Right.
Be kind.
Be kind. Yeah. It's just, but how?
Yeah.
Assuming everyone you come into contact with has a trauma background and that impacts on their mental and physical well-being, that's the basis of it. But it's a way of interacting with people that comes from experience, understanding, and a deep empathy through self-examination. It's important to kind of say, well, if I was in this situation, and maybe it's not about exactly the same thing, but how would I feel? How would I react? What would I do? And how would I want to be treated? The problem I see is that mere awareness is not enough. We can use all those words, but if we don't understand the fundamentals of trauma and how it can be expressed in individuals we work with, we won't be able to avoid retraumatisation. And we need to know how to help the person back to safety and connection. And we have to have experience working with people who have significant trauma backgrounds. And in hoarding disorder, which is the most functionally debilitating psychological disorder there is, working in this space is not for the uninitiated. I mean, going in cold like I did all those years ago was not ethical practice. I can say that now. I mean, it was so long ago. But when I look back at some of the things that I did and and some of the people I met, I can see how other people might step into that space and do exactly what I did.
And if any old life coach or massage therapist says on their website that they're trauma informed, and you go in with a degree of confidence, then okay, I'm in safe hands. And then if they're justifying that because they've watched The Accused and they felt really bad for Jodie Foster, rather than because they have any of these principles in their work, that can really damage somebody who goes to them for help.
Yeah, I discovered a new word today, which is exciting. Iatrogenic.
Iatrogenic, yeah. So harm caused by medical treatment. Yeah.
So intervention or support in the case of hoarding disorder can be iatrogenic if we don't understand the nature of the trauma. And I've seen professionals make the hoarding symptoms worse through their careless and non-trauma informed approaches. So exactly that. What you're doing with that individual impacts what all the other people in the team are working on. So it's important to kind of have some harmony in the way. And that's, I guess, the idea of trauma-informed care, that we all are on the same page. But those pages sort of seem a bit blurry. They're not really very detailed.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a friend who is a yoga teacher who did an extensive qualification to become a trauma-informed yoga teacher. And that was about 9 months of studying.
Wow.
And all about getting this kind of certification to be trauma-informed. And then she sees other yoga teachers saying, oh yeah, I'm trauma-informed, having none of that basis in their work. It's really worrying. And of course, there are all kinds of people who might deal with hoarding and people who hoard in their work who aren't therapists. So how can people who aren't therapists incorporate these trauma-informed practices? Say they work for a housing association, or they're a geriatric social worker, or they're an occupational therapist. How can it be applied to hoarding outside of therapy?
I will say, I hope that any of the occupational therapists that are part of the teams that I work with have all the trauma-informed tools in their toolkit, just saying that, or social workers, but it's not always the case. It's not always the case. So I think it's about communicating with the individual about how you're going to work with them. Be very clear about how we're going to interact. How can we communicate to each other when perhaps, you're not feeling safe? I'm going to ask you. I know I'm going to annoy you by asking you all the time, but I'm going to check in with you to check whether you're feeling safe or not. Now it's a bit like the whole "Are you okay" day. Do you have that in the UK?
No.
No. Oh, okay. It's this whole. This is exactly the same. So we've got this "Are you okay" day, and the idea is on that day you ask people, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
The problem with that is people are not prepared to assist you when they get an answer that you're not okay. Now, that's the problem with this, because if you're working with people who have trauma, you must make every effort that you can to learn about how trauma impacts the body, the brain, the digestive system, all of that sort of stuff, and continue to keep updated with what's going on in the research, because it's likely that you're going to come across someone that you're going to ask, "Are you feeling safe?" And they say no, and you're not going to be able to leave them feeling safe after you've had your session or you've been in their home, etc. So I really just think incorporating it is it's not even a maybe. It's about including it. And if you want to work with people in this space and the individual you're working with has a clinician that they're engaged with, ask for permission to talk to that person.
Yeah.
Ask for permission from your client to say, "Look, I'm working with you and I want to make sure that I'm going to be able to maintain your safety in this process. Can I speak to them and find out ways that you know how to bring yourself back to safety?" Now, that may be exposing for therapists working in the area. I don't take that lightly, but it could expose some people who don't know how to do that for their client. Go and do some deep dives. Listen to podcasts. Listen to audiobooks, whatever it might be. Read The Body Keeps the Score if you can cope. Read Peter Levine. Read, and read.
I think the collaborative element of the trauma-informed principles is also really important if you're one of these practitioners who may be working with someone in a non-therapy role, especially if you're helping them directly with their stuff. So you're not doing something for or despite them, you're doing something with them on collaborated terms.
Yes, I totally agree. And that is something that doesn't always happen. And I often feel like if that were to occur more regularly, then we would have a much smoother impact for the client. It'd be much more controlled, contained, and safe.
And Dr. Sarah Hanson and Dr. Bryony Porter did a report that I thought was really interesting, because what they found was that housing workers, when working with people who hoard, knew they were dealing with traumatized people without doubt, but they were wary of being trauma-informed because they weren't mental health workers and they didn't know how to deal with the trauma, which relates to what you were just saying. I'd want to say that being trauma-informed isn't the same as saying that the client has to tell the worker their trauma. Nobody is owed the details of our trauma, and we are entitled to keep that to ourselves in any situation, with a therapist, with friends. But I would also say the worker doesn't have to know the trauma details to have a trauma-informed approach. So what would you say? I think you might have covered some of it in your last answer, but to that particular anxiety with this approach amongst people who might know they're dealing with traumatized people but aren't mental health professionals.
There is that fear factor for so many about trauma and its treatment. I feel it myself, when I meet a new client and they open up about their trauma. Like, I'm concerned sometimes that they share perhaps sometimes share too much too early and then feel scared of what they've shared and then don't want to come back for more therapy. So sometimes there's a need to put the brakes on a little bit with individuals as the therapist. But we don't need to know what the trauma is in order to help someone who's experienced it. We just need to be aware that various things might be triggers for them, and then attempting to work with someone when they don't feel safe and don't trust you is a recipe for retraumatization. I mean, that's just, it's a fait accompli. But it is all in the communication, setting the parameters of the relationship. You know, you work in social housing, ergo, you will be dealing with people with a trauma background. And you're not there to treat them.
No.
Like if we replace trauma with back injury, for example, you know, you wouldn't expect to treat this person's injury, but you would be expected to understand their limitations and symptoms that might impact their ability to engage with the Department of Housing. It's like, it's just...
And I think in a lot of cases, the tenant wouldn't expect you to treat them. But even if you are dealing with a tenant whose boundaries are a bit looser and are expecting that from you, it is okay to say that in a nicer way than this, but kind of that's beyond my scope. Here's who I can refer you to.
Yes, exactly.
And they can feel a lot of pressure, I think, especially if you've been in traditional mental health services. They can feel from the client's point of view like there's an expectation to go, when I was 5, this happened, and when I was 9, this happened, and when I was 14, this happened, and these are the details. I find that I go through cycles where there are times I need to tell the stories and I need to tell the details and I need to go through that. And then there are other times when that doesn't feel important for me to go through the detail. I need to talk more about how it feels now or how it affects me or that kind of thing. I think back to therapy now, this is more of a therapy conversation. I need my therapist to be okay with whichever of those two spaces I'm in.
Yes.
Whether I'm in a let me tell you the precise detail of exactly what happened stage, or in a there was a thing, it was horrible, this is how I feel now stage.
Look, it can take years. It can take, you know, in my work, some client 3 years before I know even what that trauma might be.
Yeah.
I just have to work in that space of going, well, I know it's there, and I know that this person feels these things and that certain things are re-traumatizing. And I just have to give them the space to either tell me everything or just tell me, you know, in a general sense of what that might be.
And that needs to be okay on both sides. There's no expectation either way. And you as the therapist may have some curiosity about, but it's still not your right to know if they're not ready to say.
No, exactly.
Or indeed, if it just doesn't feel important for them to say.
Exactly. There is that misconception that people need to
go in and list it all.
Yeah. And that can be a people-pleasing kind of over-explaining. Like, you know, we tend to want to over-explain everything because we fear that we're going to get in trouble if we don't give them enough information or whatever. But it's okay. It's okay to say no, and not, if someone says, you want to do this, and you say, oh, that's lovely of you to ask, but no, I'm not interested. You don't have to tell them anymore.
Yeah. No is a complete sentence.
No is a complete sentence.
And certainly for a while, at least, in statutory mental health services, there was a period where one of the first things you did with any new worker was a timeline of your life. I don't know if that's still done because I've not been in statutory mental health services for a while, but it would literally be that list. And sometimes you'd have to label, is this a big T or a little t, like a big trauma or a little trauma? And it just felt so reductive. And the other thing about, I know certainly when I was younger, I felt sometimes a pressure to tell the detail to justify why I'm there. like, this is serious because listen to this. And thankfully, I don't tend to get that now. But that's an internal, or maybe external to some degree, pressure that I felt that I need to give the details so that people know I'm serious.
And the more you tell that story, the more it becomes, conceptualized self. That's the person I kind of am, and this happened to me, and this is why I do this, and this is why. And it may actually, not be that, but that's the story that is being drilled into your mind.
So I read a lot in this research about minimizing retraumatization. Now, the obvious thing that comes to mind is kind of forced clearances in the context of hoarding. But what kind of situations or treatments or circumstances could be re-traumatizing for people who hoard?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
This podcast started as an outlet for myself, but 200,000 downloads later, it's somehow become much more than that to a lot of people. I hear from people that me talking about my experiences and interviewing specialists and experts is helping them too. Hearing those stories makes the time and cost absolutely worth it. But if you want to help to ensure that the future of the podcast is sustainable, you can donate to help with costs. To send a one-off or recurring donation, just go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate. Thank you.
Having a stranger enter their home, having a bunch of strangers enter their home wearing hazmat outfits without discussing it in detail and agreeing on the process in advance. I'm talking to you, people out there who do that stuff. So it is a forced, but even not a forced clear out, but just arriving with all of your stuff and there being a team, of people. That is just re-traumatizing. Having anyone touch their possessions without consent.
Yeah, never mind throwing it all out, even just picking something up.
Exactly. If you haven't established a trusting relationship, stop. Removing items without consent, like making decisions for them that you think are fine from your perspective. I'm talking about young people who don't understand that maybe a person has not always had enough food on the table, has not always had access to, to healthy meals, and you're sorting through their pantry and you're throwing things out that according to you are outside of their use by. Well, just stop before you do that. Using words like chuck, toss, throw for letting go of possessions.
Junk, even.
Junk. Oh, yes, please just get those out of the lexicon. You just don't go there. So many ways that people charge in kind of with this idea that it's just clutter and let's just help them get on top of the messy. That is just a dangerous game for everyone involved because the person dismissed, they don't feel understood, their safe space has been invaded. I think that there's a misconception about how painful it is for people to come into your safe space and touch things.
I had a mental health support worker many years ago when my house was a mess, but in a better state. And she was helping me tidy up, and she was so lovely. And she was kind of getting it right. She was just getting it right. She was giving me choices about everything, even if it seemed obviously rubbish. But she used to call things, she didn't call it like my junk or my crap she used to call things my treasures. Yeah. And I really appreciated that was a recognition that this was stuff with meaning. Even if maladaptive, even if irrational, she was recognizing that this was inherently meaningful to me or valuable to me in some way. And so when looking at my many treasures, what can we do to, improve my surroundings? It was...
What's she doing now?
I know. I feel like she was just instinctively good at it. I don't think she'd been trained in, helping a hoarder to clean up. I think she just was instinctively very respectful. And I thanked her once for not throwing anything away without checking. And she was like, but it's your stuff. I can't throw it away. She was absolutely stunned by the idea that she might.
Yeah, I know. I just think that is just the place to come from.
Yeah.
And as you build up that trusting relationship, the idea is that the individual will come to that point where you know what they will let go of and what they won't. You know what's important and what's not. You understand where the line is. And also you recognize that you don't know the purpose for everything that the person says. I mean, some of the amazing things people use their stuff for, they may have way too many ideas on how they could use it, but quite often there'll be one distinct reason. This is for X, Y, Z. Oh, okay. It's the curiosity to not assuming that you know what is right is a very good place to come from, I think.
So as we've alluded to, well, I don't think we've even alluded to it, as we've said.
Yes.
Anybody can slap the words trauma-informed on their website, and we've no idea whether they're experts or specialists or somebody who once read a Guardian article about something bad happening to someone. Even in this research, I found some resources that seem to assume that if a therapy was intended for somebody who'd been traumatized, it would automatically be the same as it being trauma-informed. So are there ways, how can we tell how seriously somebody takes those words and how knowledgeable they are about it, whether they're a therapist or a coach or a professional organizer or anybody else?
Well, it's so important. This is a very important point. I think this is something we can't answer from just looking at the copy that is on a person's website. If they just state they're trauma-informed without any evidence of training at all, there's a red flag for me. I do recommend that you call them and talk to them or send them an email, an inquiry email, if a call isn't something that you can manage. I'd ask them to tell you how they work with people who've experienced interpersonal trauma. What steps would they take to avoid re-traumatisation during a session? You know, if you were re-traumatised, how would they help bring you back to the present? This should expose those who are not really aware of the workings of the nervous system and how to work with someone who is feeling unsafe.
Even questions like, so some people say there are 5 pillars, some people say there are 3 or 6 or 10. Which of the trauma-informed principles do you follow? Which pillars, represent the work you do?
Yeah, exactly. I just think just drilling down and getting them to give you a little bit more information, you'll soon recognise a gloss over of the concept or a misunderstanding or whatever. But remember, you don't need to explain what the details of the trauma are. And as I said earlier, this can be a trauma response. We tend to over-explain when we're stressed and write extremely long introductory emails to people. It's our please and appease response. That's our fawning trauma response. But stand firm, just ask the questions. And if you don't feel confident and you haven't had a recommendation from someone else, someone you trust, someone who you believe knows their stuff, then keep looking. Keep looking.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you deserve to have the people helping you do so in a way that, first of all, doesn't cause more damage, and secondly, actually helps you in a really proactive way. Like the original kind of definition of trauma-informed care we read said, trauma-informed care isn't a method of treatment. It's like a way of looking at everything you do and tailoring it. And it's broad umbrella principles that are then applied differently from person to person. I think that's the key, isn't it?
It is. And I've often seen and read things where, There might be for example, a domestic abuse clinic or something, and they've got it right next door to the TAB, or the empathy. Imagine walking in the shoes of that person, coming up to your front door. What will they experience? What will they experience when they enter? Where will they go? Where will they wait? All of that sort of things just comes into play when you talk about trauma-informed treatment, everything trauma-related. You want the process to be as comfortable as it possibly can be for that person.
Yeah, because if all of the therapy you provide is beautifully trauma-informed, but your receptionist on the desk outside is rude and aggressive and angry, that's not a safer environment.
No, or doesn't look you in the eye as they're typing away, or,
Yeah.
It's a vibe. It's a vibe.
Yeah.
It's just a way of approaching.
So, Jan, our favourite bit of every episode, if people want to find you online, where can they do so?
If they want to hang out with me on Instagram or X, formerly Twitter, at stuff_ology is my handle, or Facebook, Stuffology Consulting. Check out the website, stuffology.com.au. Sign up for the newsletter every Sunday for free. And email me whenever you like, jan@stuffology.com.au. I love hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Jan. As ever, another informative and helpful episode.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. May we take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record and listen to this podcast today. I am speaking on the lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their connection to country, both land and sea, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
Shout out to the Learning Leader Show, which I will link to in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Here, our podcast fave, James Clear, has something really on the ball to say. Have a listen.
Planning and preparation are very important. It's just that at some point, planning becomes its own form of procrastination. Yep. And if your preparation is complementing the actions that you're taking, great. It's doing a lot of value. If your preparation and planning, your research are substituting for actions that you should be taking, now they've outlived their usefulness and it's no longer valuable.
As somebody who spent an hour creating a spreadsheet weekly planner yesterday, when I could and should have been actually doing the things that went on the planner, yeah, I need to hear that. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to that Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.